Good morning, everyone, and thanks for having me. Very glad to be in front of you this morning. I am going to be talking about the GDPR a bit more, something we've heard about a good bit already today, but trying to keep this very much from being a pitch. We'll talk about how companies are implementing it, what's working, where we're seeing common stumbles, and some things that you can take away back to your organization. As mentioned, I am a vice president at OneTrust. We have about 1,600 customers today, and our business is exclusively around privacy management. So I'll give you a little bit of context on that. Prior to OneTrust, many of us on the leadership team had been with another company, AirWatch, if you're familiar with it, a mobile security, mobile device management company where we spent many years building that from a startup to eventually selling that to VMware for a good exit. Along the way, we saw our growth really take off with the trend towards BYOD and the iPhone and Android devices eclipsing BlackBerry. As that happened, we kind of saw the growth plateau a bit because of paranoia around if I take my own device to work, what happens with the employer managing it? Are they going to be spying on me? Are they going to be looking at my pictures, my text messages, or wiping the device if I ever leave? And it was with that we started to understand there's a real concern around privacy and the individual, and that privacy is an issue that many organizations deal with from a lens of security, which is, of course, important in representing the interests of the company. But as you look at the individual, the human, privacy really becomes that paramount concern for them, and that there would be something that was going to have to change there as more information was being collected. Fast forward to where we are today with the GDPR, and of course this is very, very topical right now. So we've all heard some of the scary stories about GDPR and what it's going to mean for your organization. Again, major changes that are coming that your organization will have to deal with depending on the size and the nature of your business. There are significant reforms that are coming, whether you collect that information or you work for other companies that do, either as a processor or a controller. Again, this is going to impact your organization. The GDPR itself lays out a long list of obligations that you have around how you handle the data and what you're collecting and your basis for processing it, what you're authorized to do with it, etc. It's important to note that not only do you have to get compliant with all of these things, you have to maintain that and be ready to demonstrate your compliance. So going through all of this effort once is not going to be enough. It is something that you're going to have to live and breathe, and there's going to be a lot of complex, sophisticated operational changes that will need to be made as part of that to maintain compliance. I've seen a few people take pictures. If anybody would like a copy of the slides after the presentation today, I'd be happy to share them with you as well. As you look over your obligations, again, security tends to be where a lot of people start, and that's an important aspect of it. But I should note that of the 99 articles that are in GDPR, only one addresses security, and it does so in a somewhat ambiguous way. It suggests that you use a risk-based approach to balance the needs or the security concerns, the risks that you see, with the controls and technology and methodologies that you can implement to try to mitigate some of that. So again, looking at this just through the lens of security is certainly not going to be enough, that there's going to be a lot more to it than just that. The other misconception I often see is that a lot of people will talk about the fines, the 2% or the 4% of global turnover. Certainly that's an important aspect of it. If you look at the way a regulator inquiry might run, you're going to generally begin with some sort of a warning. It may be a 2% or 4% fine based on the nature of the infraction. Of course, again, those are very scary, but it's what really could come after that that becomes very important, I think, for most organizations. Under the GDPR, any data subjects, that is the individuals that you're processing information about, your customers, your clients, your partners, even your employees, have the ability to query you, to submit a request to get information on what it is that you're collecting on them. You not only have to respond to that, you have to do so within 30 days, showing them what information you have on them, and then they may want to correct the record or ask that they be forgotten. You've heard of the right to be forgotten. All of these requests have to be actioned very quickly by your organization. You can ask for a one-time extension or postponement of that, but that's only going to give you another 30 days, and you're required to evidence your reason for it. You can't just say, I didn't have a chance to get to it. There has to be some justification for why you need a little more time. Now, in the event of a breach or something that hits the newspapers or something that comes out about your organization, the concern we see is not only are the inquiries going to start with the regulators, and again, there may be some fines that get attached to whatever it is that they address and the lack of compliance that they see, but then you're going to start getting hit with all of these requests. And this could almost be a DDoS attack where you see them just pouring in from thousands or hundreds of thousands of customers, depending on the nature of your business. And that's really the thing that could be paralyzing to an organization as you think about what would be required for your organization to evidence everything that you have on your customers. It's not only the transactions, it could be support calls that were recorded, it could be any postal correspondence. All of that has to be produced and shared with them and then perhaps corrected, again, depending on what it is that they're looking for. Behind that, then we've got class action lawsuits that are also available as part of this. So I say this to mention the fines are an important consideration, and that is driving a lot of urgency for organizations, but know that that's not the only consequence, that there's much more to this the organizations may have to contend with under the GDPR. Of course, the needs are evolving here. We see that there is a growing need for DPOs, data privacy officers. You have an obligation here under the law, again, depending on the size and nature of what you're doing, to have someone in place in-house on this. And these stats are from Gartner showing that this year we are seeing a jump just in the last 2 years from about 25,000 positions being posted to this year it should be in excess of 85,000. So if you're looking for a new career path, this is one that's very promising, of course. All right, so I wanted to flash up, of course, just again, some of the general concerns and why we see this as such an emerging need across so many organizations. It is a multifaceted sort of set of requirements that you're going to have to deal with across the business, how you're dealing with your customers, the information that's being collected, many, many areas to this that you're going to have to think through and, again, perhaps re-engineer across your business. I wanted to, as I said at the top of my talk, keep this from being much of a pitch, though, and really talk about some of the operational changes as you look at this, how your organization will have to move. You may have some kind of privacy controls in place. Certainly there's a basis in the law today, but for many organizations, this is something that they maybe looked at once a year. They did a little bit of reporting internally or analysis of their processes. Now, under GDPR, you move to something that is going to be more evergreen. It's going to have to be constant. It's going to have to be built in to everything that you do. This concept of privacy by design really will trickle down into almost every facet of your business. So as we look at how it's being acted across organizations, very often business will put together sort of a hit squad or a SWAT team to go look at certain processes and try to figure out where we are in terms of the law. From there, they move to ongoing program roles, and this is where you want to really develop a true cross-function team that's represented perhaps by legal. You've got some executive buy-in, and then you've got the different privacy folks from across the organization that report up through this DPO structure. So important that you get buy-in across marketing, accounting, any area of the business that is going to be collecting and processing information. You want some involvement. You want to build that champion into the way that your team is working. There's sort of 10 steps that we would generally point to as you look to tackle the problem, and I would start with doing a quick gap analysis. Now, we at OneTrust offer a free tool for this, and again, if you'd like to come by the booth today, we can give you a license to try this. But very quickly looking at what information is being collected across the organization. Again, what is your legal basis for doing it? Where is the information going? How is it being processed? Some very simple, fundamental questions that you'll want to understand to start to determine your compliance posture with the law today. This is also going to be very useful as you try to think through what needs to get done between now and May 25th to show that you're making a good faith effort towards getting into compliance. As you work through this, again, you'll have to tackle some serious questions around the information that's being collected, why it's being collected, what it was the original purpose for this, and have you stayed true to this? Is there information that's being collected that's not necessary, perhaps over collection of data that could be a liability or a risk to that individual that you'll want to stop? Again, these are all important parts of just understanding where you are in your compliance against the law, and you'll find that this free tool that we offer gives you some very quick hits to get through that and start working towards getting compliant. Now, under GDPR Article 30, you're going to have to compile an inventory of processes across your organization, and you'll have to have this ready to show to a regulator really almost at a moment's notice if they need to understand what's being collected in a given area and, again, why it was being collected. So putting together a data mapping here of where all of the data lives and the processing that goes behind it is going to be a fundamental step in achieving GDPR compliance. Get that record of processing in, showing where the data is, perhaps where it's going. Are there any cross-border data flows moving between different countries? You don't have to have a visualization like this. Of course, it can be helpful. The important thing, though, is just making sure that you've got a clean record that you can show where the data is going and, again, how it's being processed. Moving beyond that, you'll want to consider the privacy that's built into certain functions, particularly anything that might be trafficking in special categories of data. Now, under the law, this is defined as key bits of information that would be very, very sensitive to the individual, things like religion, race, trade union membership, those special categories of data that should be treated with a higher degree of sensitivity, and really, again, should only be collected if there's a valid reason, if you can really justify why it's being done, and that the user is consenting to it at some level, or there's a necessary reason for collecting it. Wherein you have those processes, you'll want a data protection impact assessment to understand, again, is there any impact to the collection? Is there a high risk because of the sensitivity of the data? And if so, how do we mitigate that risk? Can we stop collecting certain pieces of information that maybe aren't necessary? Can we obscure the way that they're being handled, or perhaps build in additional protections? And if you can't, you may need to actually go to your authority, here in the UK, the ICO, and ask for mercy, or at least consult them on what's being collected and again, the reason for it. Better to inform than to have them come calling and asking about it later. So you see some samples here of it and how you can categorize the risk. Again, these are ways you can do it in our tool, but this is not the only way. Of course, you can do some of these things manually, but setting some thresholds here to understand the risk and make calculations or informed decisions on how you're handling these categories of data. Next, we would suggest looking at your vendors. Again, under the law, if you're collecting information, even if one of your partners has some sort of breach, you are very likely to be responsible for the impact of that. You may share that with the processor, or it may squarely fall on you. So we see today a lot of organizations having to go back and review contracts. This can be an upstream or downstream supplier that you're working with that you may have some responsibility around. This is, again, a major blind spot for a lot of organizations that they're just now coming to grips with. You've got to understand what happens in the event of a breach anywhere along that supply chain. Again, this may be a consultant you work with. It could be a marketing company that you did a campaign with. Anyone in there that has an issue could potentially create a responsibility for you to communicate and rectify, even if it wasn't anything that you had to do with it, if your security policies were compliant and the breach wasn't on your side. Next, I mentioned data subject requests. Again, these are individuals that could be querying your organization to ask what you have about them. You've got to start taking steps to prepare to respond to these. The clock starts immediately upon that request being submitted, and as I noted, you have about 30 days to respond to it. So have you thought this through across the business? Have we built in some plan for who's going to ingest the request and then track it through to completion, making sure that every department that needs to respond is informed and that somebody is managing or escalating those requests as we go? Again, you see a sample here of a form that we might use to collect the request from the individual and then work it through to make sure that they are being followed up on. You treat this almost like a service desk or help desk request to action it and escalate it along the way and make sure that we are staying compliant with the timelines and schedules that are prescribed under the law. Next is consent, and the basis or the requirements for you to demonstrate consent are going to change greatly under the law here. And this is another area that we see many organizations shying away from consent as a basis for processing data. If you are, let's say, sending out newsletters or doing other outbound communications or any number of marketing campaigns that may rely on consent, you'll want to look back at what was collected. Did you have an explicit permission granted from that user to continue marketing to them? I don't have time to go into a lot of detail on this right now, but we'd love to talk about it more because, again, this appears to be a very, very great area of concern for many organizations as they look at their own consent policies and how they adhere to the new conditions and requirements under the law. Step 7, we would look at incident and breach management. I would advise you to think through some of these policies. Again, many of your organizations already have sort of a breach response policy in place. You know what you're going to do if there's some sort of event. Look at now your legal requirements under the law. And here you'll see some, again, some changes, and this can be almost different from one jurisdiction to the next. but how you have to respond, how you have to inform your authorities. And most will be, again, an evolving area of the law over the next year that could have a lot of impact for many of your organizations. Again, depending if you have e-commerce or just a large web presence, this is an area of the law you'll want to keep a close eye on. Some samples here of what that can look like. Of course, training and making sure that the organization is well informed. Privacy is going to certainly be everyone's responsibility, and how this translates into each individual and their job is going to be an important area to consider. So certainly want to look at your policies, your training, making sure everyone is informed again of their obligations under the law. And then lastly, ongoing monitoring to ensure that you are staying compliant. This, again, there's so many different areas of your business that will be impacted by the GDPR, making sure that you maintain compliance against those, and as the law evolves and we see some of the first enforcement actions happen, I can assure you that there's going to be some things that still change before we even go into May with the law, and then even beyond it. So keeping compliant with the law and any changes that come will be a critical part of the success of your program. All right, so I'll jump to the end because I know we're just about out of time. I did mention we have a booth upstairs, and we'd love to come by and have a conversation with you. We can talk about any areas of the presentation today. I've also got my slides, as I mentioned, and we brought a number of GDPR books. So if anyone's interested, we've got sort of a desk reference. It's a handy text that not only has the different articles of the law, but also all the recitals. Come by and get a copy, and let us know if you'd be interested in testing any of the tools. Thanks very much for letting me speak this morning.